Tune into the NBA on any given night, and you might see things that would have once looked impossible in the early aughts of the league. Whether it's 7-foot point center Nikola Jokic casually dissecting defenses like they're kids on a playground, or supersized point guard Luka Doncic routinely dropping 20-point quarters and flirting with triple-doubles like potential hinge dates, or 7'5" French anomaly Victor Wembanyama swatting away shots like he's a monster from Space Jam. Across the league, teams are currently posting record highs in offensive rating and true shooting percentage, illustrating that basketball has never been played more efficiently than it is today. And out of necessity, the league has birthed a new wave of freakishly skilled defenders to take on the near impossible task of keeping these offensive supernovas in check. Yet even with this youth movement, the old guard refuses to wither away. Kevin Durant is still a walking 25 points at the ripe age of 37. Steph Curry is still Steph Curry when he could stay on the court. Even LeBron is still outsmarting opponents and squeezing every last ounce of production that he can from his immortal basketball career. Mix this all together, and you have a league that's overflowing with talent from top to bottom, which raises a big question that I'll attempt to answer today. Is this the most talented era in NBA history? To answer that, let's first define what I mean by talent, because that word means different things to different people. This isn't about proving that players are bigger, faster, and stronger than they were 40 to 50 years ago. It's not about comparing who can jump the highest or run the fastest. Instead, I'm measuring talent by evaluating the single most important skill, a player's ability to influence winning basketball games in their particular era. Sometimes that's done with raw athleticism. Sometimes it's with pure IQ. I don't care how a player does it, only that they're able to do it. That, to me, is talent. And fortunately, Basketball Reference has a metric called win shares that captures exactly that, quantifying how much a player contributes to winning on a per season, per game, and per minute basis. So using this metric, we can track the progression of player impact over time. Since the league didn't expand past 20 teams until the late 1970s, I've started my analysis in the 1980s to provide a cleaner historical baseline. So before we judge today's players, let's take a walk down the NBA's memory lane to illustrate the evolution of NBA talent. The 1980s are often credited as the beginning of the modern NBA, defined by the rivalry between Larry Bird's Celtics and Magic Johnson's Lakers, which brought an unprecedented amount of attention to the league. But they weren't the only two stars in the NBA. With just 23 teams in the league for most of the decade, talent was concentrated to a few great teams. Larry Bird had Hall of Fame running mates like Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, and Dennis Johnson. Magic had Kareem and James Worthy. And the 76ers paired Moses Malone and Julius Erving while adding Charles Barkley to the mix 2 years after winning the title in 1983. You could say, in a way, that this was the original Super Team era. But if we zoom out and focus on the top 100 players based on total win shares from the decade, 1980s players rank last among all decades in total win shares per game, and win shares per minute. Even shrinking this comparison down to the top 10 players from each decade, the 80s also rank last in win shares per game and win shares per minute. So not only was the league's depth relatively thin, which is understandable given the NBA was still expanding, but its stars were carrying a lighter load than future eras. Bird and Magic were standouts that would have been elite in any decade, don't get me wrong, but players like Kareem and Kevin McHale, who ranked 4th and 6th in total win shares across the 1980s, would have placed closer to the fringes of the top 10 or 15 in subsequent eras. That's less of a knock on their talent individually, these are all-time great players, but more of a reflection of the broader context of the league. With the presence of other superstar teammates around them, they didn't need to shoulder the burden of their franchises. teams instead prioritized balance and shared responsibility compared to the more superstar-driven periods to come. It's for this reason that I believe many remain nostalgic about this era of the NBA, as basketball was played at its most fundamental, team-driven form. But on a raw talent basis, it's clear that the league hadn't yet reached its peak. As the NBA entered the 90s, it began to resemble the league we know today. For starters, the league grew to 27 teams in the late 80s and to 29 teams by 1995. Just one less franchise than we have today. As a result, top talent began to spread across a greater number of teams, allowing a wave of franchise-carrying superstars to take flight. Of course, there was Michael Jordan, who peaked higher than any NBA player ever has on the 90s Bulls, redefining what an NBA superstar could be. But he wasn't alone. Charles Barkley, David Robinson, and Karl Malone all reached their MVP-level ceilings as well, each carrying contending teams throughout the decade. Top 10 players from the 90s played the most minutes per game of any era, collectively producing the most total win shares and win shares per game. Additionally, depth across the league took a dramatic leap as well. Expanding out to top 100 players, production spiked noticeably on both a per-game and per-minute basis relative to the 1980s. The influx of talent from expansion-era drafts brought players like Danny Manning, Derek Coleman, and Kenny Anderson. Players who made all-star appearances in the 90s and yet didn't even crack the top 50 in total win shares for the decade. Overall, the 90s both raised the bar for superstar impact while simultaneously growing the pool of quality NBA contributors, paving the way for basketball in the 21st century. But the progression of NBA talent wasn't perfectly linear throughout history. The 2000s produced another incredible class of superstars like Kobe Bryant, Shaq, Tim Duncan, Dirk Nowitzki, and Kevin Garnett. But none of these players filled the gap that Michael Jordan left behind. The distance between Jordan's win shares per minute in the 90s and Tim Duncan, who led 2000 superstars in the same metric, was equivalent to the gap between Duncan and Tracy McGrady during the 2000s. But while the top of the food chain dipped, the overall talent level was still expanding. The 2000s brought a surge of high-end contributors, with the role of a complementary player evolving into more of a complementary star. Top 50 players from the 2000s lead every decade in history in total win shares per game, and win shares per minute. Think of players like Tony Parker and Rip Hamilton, multi-time All-Stars who thrived as elite complementary pieces on championship teams. Another defining trend was teams leaning more heavily on their starting caliber players. Top 10 players averaged the second most minutes per game of any era behind the 1990s, and the top 25, top 50, and top 100 players from the 2000s all played more minutes per game than their counterparts in other decades. So even if star production declined on a per-minute basis, overall win share totals were propped up based on the sheer number of minutes these players were spending on the court. The 2000s aren't remembered for their aesthetic appeal. The grinding physicality of the late 80s and 90s reached its breaking point, culminating in playoff slugfests where games were routinely played in the 60s and 70s. A defining visual of the decade was the Malice at the Palace, where physical basketball led to a massive confrontation between players and fans. But in these dark times, seeds of new age NBA basketball were planted. The 7 seconds or less Suns, led by Steve Nash, revolutionized a new offensive philosophy of pace and space. And by the end of the decade, the league began to find a happy medium between the egalitarian style of the 80s and the superstar-centric approach of the 90s, setting the stage for the three-headed monsters that would define the 2010s. The 2010s represented a sea change for basketball, both on and off the court. One emerging trend was the culture of load management, reshaping how teams use their star players. If we compare across decades, top players in the 2010s played less games per season and less minutes per game than any prior decade. Consider that the top 25 players in total win shares from the 2010s averaged fewer minutes per game than top 50 players from the 90s and 2000s. And with less time on the floor, star players in the 2010s produced the lowest win share totals since the 1980s. But viewing this era solely through total production undersells its talent level. Compared to previous decades, top 25 players from the 2010s posted the highest win shares per minute by a wide margin, and the trend holds for top 100 players as well. The rise in efficiency can be attributed to a fundamental shift in basketball style, with Steph Curry and the dynastic Warriors sparking a three-point revolution that forced the league to evolve to keep up. Take league-wide effective field goal percentage, for example, which jumped from 50.1% at the start of the decade to 52.4% by the end of the decade. You also saw the Michael Jordan-sized void from the 2000s filled by LeBron James, who became the league's next outlier megastar, making 8 straight finals and winning 3 championships throughout the 2010s. And surrounding LeBron was a rich blend of talent, with new icons like Kevin Durant, James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, and Russell Westbrook, alongside aging greats like Dwayne Wade, Chris Paul, Tim Duncan, and Dirk Nowitzki. As the talent pool deepened, the era of the super team was born, with the new standard for contention shifting from dynamic duos to big threes or even fours. Miami featured LeBron, Wade, and Chris Bosh. Golden State built its dynasty with Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green, before eventually adding Kevin Durant to form a vice grip on the league. The Spurs won a title with Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker, and Kawhi Leonard. The Lob City Clippers rolled out 3 All-Stars. And when LeBron returned to Cleveland in the middle of the decade, he joined forces with Kyrie Irving and Kevin Love. The 2010s were a transformative decade for basketball, defined by unprecedented shot-making and the consolidation of superstars to form some of the greatest teams we've seen in modern basketball. This ultimately laid the groundwork for the hyper-efficient, star-studded league that we have today. In this current era of NBA basketball, the league took every major trend from the 2010s and slammed the turbo button. League-wide effective field goal percentage, which peaked just above 52% at the end of the 2010s, has been above 54% league-wide every year since 2022. In the 2015-16 season, when the Warriors blitzed the league from three-point range and went 73-9, teams averaged 24.1 threes per game. In the 2020s, teams routinely averaged 35 or more threes per game, while converting these shots at an even higher percentage. Load management also went into hyperdrive. Top 10 players by total win shares this decade are averaging nearly 6 fewer games per season than comparable stars from prior eras. Both top 10 and top 100 players are logging the least minutes per game of any decade in modern NBA history. As a result, teams are now deeper than ever, relying on 10 or more rotation players just to keep their stars fresh for the postseason. And yet, despite players spending less time on the court than ever, per-minute production is at all-time high levels. The top 10, top 25, and top 100 players of the 2020s lead all decades in average win shares per minute. On a per-minute basis, 2020's Nikola Jokic rivals peak 90s Michael Jordan and surpasses even LeBron's historic production in the 2010s. And Giannis isn't far behind, producing at levels that eclipse even Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. You also have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Luka Doncic putting up historically great offensive production, with Shai's Thunder looking like potential spiritual successors to the 90s Bulls. And this is all happening while many of the headliners from the prior decade are still here. LeBron, Steph, KD, James Harden, Chris Paul, and Kawhi Leonard have each made All-NBA teams this decade, refusing to let the new era of superstars seized control of the league without major resistance. Another major factor this decade has been the growth of the game internationally. Jokic, Giannis, SGA, and Luka were all born outside of the United States. And Victor Wembanyama, potentially the next defining star of the league, was born in France. American-born superstars like Jason Tatum and Anthony Edwards have more competition than ever to top the league's hierarchy. This trend of an increasing depth of talent holds further downstream as well. Take a player like Jamal Murray, who might have been a perennial all-star in a previous era, but now competes against an endless wave of elite scoring guards. Or Lauri Markkanen, a 7-foot sharpshooter who once would have been labeled a unicorn, but is now a relative afterthought. Even Luka's still never won an MVP, despite routinely averaging 30-point triple-doubles per season. You plot those numbers into a prior decade, and he'd be building his house on top of MVP trophies. And there's still much more time for this decade to establish itself historically. Many of these stars are just entering their primes. If Wemby stays healthy, who knows what his ceiling can be? Cooper Flagg's going to join the mix soon. And this upcoming draft class is chock full of incredible prospects like AJ DeBonsa, Cam Boozer, and Darren Peterson. But all of this talent comes with the trade-off of parity. No player or team has seized control of the league this decade. We've had 7 different champions in 7 straight seasons. Unprecedented for a league that was built on its dynasties. If this trend holds, it will raise tough questions historically. Can Jokic really enter the Mount Rushmore conversation if he ends his career with just 1 title? Can Shea and the Thunder rip off multiple titles in a row when the league is this deep? We measure great players on the ultimate achievement of winning championships. But what happens now that winning a championship is harder than ever? Time will tell how we'll view this era historically, and I expect that our criteria for evaluating players against prior eras is going to need to evolve. Because to me, there has never been a more talented era of NBA basketball than the one we are witnessing right now.